and Dembash. This is Sarah Glynn for Media News. I've been writing a weekly Kurdish news review for Media News for over a year, but this is my first recorded interview, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Steve Wijze as my first guest. Steve is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Manchester, and we will be discussing the old and fundamental question of the right to resistance. I've read or listened to many people making the argument that the PKK should be removed from the terrorist lists of the European Union, the US, and the UK. They focus on the political argument and on the legal argument. I hope today's discussion will help us also to engage with the ethical arguments about what has been labelled terrorism. It is widely understood that the decision to list the PKK is ultimately a political one, and it is argued that delisting would be an important political step towards a peaceful and dignified future for the Kurdish people. Reference is also frequently made to the important decision by Belgium's highest court that the PKK should not be considered a terrorist organisation, but rather a party in a non-international armed conflict, which makes it subject to the laws of war and not criminal law. The international law on which this decision was based developed in response to the post-war anti-colonial struggles and came out of a recognition that these had to challenge the belief that governments must have a monopoly on the use of violence. To win the case, the Belgian lawyers had to prove that the PKK was big enough and organised enough to act like an army. The resistance allowed in law is a response to the political realities of actually existing liberation struggles and not to fundamental principles. But if we want to start asking questions about who is a terrorist and how this term is used to mark some people and organisations as beyond the pale, if we want to challenge the assumptions on which politics is based, we come up against the basic ethical question of the right to violent resistance. While this question should be vital to any understanding of the nature of the PKK, our conversation today will look at general issues rather than this specific example. Dr. Wijze is not afraid to ask questions about difficult concepts. He's even an expert on evil, and he has kindly agreed to guide us through a debate that has engaged philosophers for centuries. It will then be up to us how to apply these ideas to our own political understandings. So, Steve, can I begin by asking you to define what is meant by the right to resistance and to give us a quick history of the development of this idea?
Right, well, thank you very much, first of all, for asking me onto this discussion. It's always nice to be able to share ideas. I just want to give a little bit of background. I'm a political theorist, so I talk in general moral terms and normative terms rather than in the actual practical cases on the ground. The normative constraints or the moral terms do frame what happens on the ground, but there are all sorts of complications which we'll get into as the discussion goes on. So your first question is about what is meant by the right to resist or right to resistance. Well, it's very simply this, that if human beings are taken to have some kind of right to live a life free of oppression or free of tyranny, then when you are subject to those particular kinds of actions by either your own government or by external forces or even by fellow citizens, whatever it is, then there is a right and perhaps even a duty to resist those kinds of actions. These kinds of resisting can take many different forms, as you know, and this discussion is going to be mostly about violent resistance. I should add right at the beginning that one has an obligation to try and find non-violent ways of resisting whenever that is possible. Violent resistance comes only after certain thresholds have been crossed. So that's the very first point to take seriously. There's always an obligation to go for non-violent resistance, to do things either by passive resistance or by civil disobedience or something of that kind before one moves on to the more violent and extreme ways of resisting tyranny. And we'll talk more about that later, about when that threshold, what it is and when it can be crossed. As for the background that you asked me about, the history of the development of this idea, I'm certainly not an historian, and I couldn't give you a very detailed account of what's going on, but most political theorists, all the way from Plato onwards, have been talking about when it's appropriate to resist tyranny and the grounds for doing that. Perhaps the most interesting one from the point of view of Western political philosophy would be the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, which is around late 1700s, where I think it was article, I have to check, I think it was article number 20, it was the very last article anyway, where it's considered to be a sacred right. Yeah, I've got it over here. Let me just read it to you because it's probably the best idea. It says, when the government violates the rights of people, insurrection is for the people and for each portion of the people. The most sacred of rights and the most indispensable of duties is, as I said, the right to resist. This is article number 35. So at that point, you can see that it's being built into the rights of individuals to resist tyranny and oppression when it is visited upon them by either their own government or external forces. I should just add as well that there's a very nice article for your listeners to get to look at by Ian McDaniel. It's a symposium on the resistance in intellectual history and political thought. You'll find in the history of European ideas. But it's an article, it's a series of articles that goes through all the kinds of historical accounts of when it's appropriate to resist tyranny and so on.
And do you know, are there similar ideas in non-Western philosophical traditions? You've referred to Western philosophical tradition.
Yeah, so undoubtedly there are. I'm not terribly knowledgeable of them. They tend to be less well known because the dominance of Western powers over the last few hundred years has meant that the right to resistance and the philosophical ideas in the Western tradition have made their way into legal canon and statute. But I'll say this much, that the non-Western views differ in at least three different ways from the Western idea of the right to resist. The first would be really that the Western idea is much more focused on individuals rather than on different forms of entity, like the family or the state or the community. This comes back to the Western idea of liberal democracy, and that the locus of your analysis will be on individuals and individual rights and protections against the state and others. Whereas in the non-Western views, this can be watered down or have a completely different focus. Secondly, the non-Western views tend not to be so fixated on rights as we are in the West, and more concerned with particular duties. That's not to say that rights and duties don't work together, but it's where the emphasis lies. And the non-Western views tend to be more concerned with the duties of individuals within a community or within a family rather than the rights of individuals. Rights, famously, as you probably know, are considered to be trump cards. So when you have a right, it means other people can't do certain things to you. Non-Western views tend not to see rights as strongly as that and put much more emphasis on duties to your community, to your family, and so on. And thirdly, Western views tend to be much more legalistic, or at least want to enshrine this in a kind of legalism, whereas the non-Western views would be more interested in reconstruction or education or reconciliation. Now, these are very, very general points, and you'd need to read much more detail about this, but that'll give you some idea of where the fault line is between the two ways of looking at rights and the rights to resistance. You find Chinese, Japanese, African, Muslim, Hindu, all these are different. All of these will have slightly different views on the right to resistance, either established within their culture or within their particular religious views and their historical tradition.
Though perhaps not so much a fault line as a continuum.
Yeah, that's right.
When I tried to look at, in a very superficial way, I suppose, at these ideas, I found Norman Gerras particularly helpful. And I wondered, I mean, I know you've worked on his work, and I wondered if you can explain what he means when he talks about the ethics of revolution.
Okay, Norm Gerras is a very interesting theorist, because his early work is mostly within the Marxist doctrine, and I think he rightly is considered to be the person who really re-established what human nature was within the Marxist tradition, and then later on talked about Marxism or resistance or political theory and things like the Holocaust and so on. So he worked really very much in those kinds of areas, and his article on socialist revolution was an attempt to try and express and deal with a concern that he had, which I think he was right to have. And this was that amongst Marxists and in Marxist revolutions, there was a tendency to put aside certain kinds of constraints in the way in which your resistance would take place against those who were oppressing you. In this case, about capitalist societies, or against those who were preventing the worker revolutions, or whatever part of the Marxist canon that you wanted to, or the Marxist experience you wanted to deal with. And he was very concerned about this because, as he noticed and noted in his article, Marxist revolutions tended to end up with governments that were as repressive, if not more repressive, than the ones they replaced. These particular governments in their revolution, or these particular revolutionaries, poo-pooed any idea that you should have some kind of moral constraints on the way in which you conduct yourself when using violent resistance. And he wanted to bring in some of the ideas of just war theory, some liberal ideas of individual rights, and constrain the kinds of activities that revolutionaries could have, specifically Marxist revolutionaries or left-wing revolutionaries, in the way in which they resisted tyranny and oppression. And he held to the view, which I think makes him fairly unique among those arguing in this area, that individuals have certain rights which are, as he puts it, very close to absolute. And what he means by that is that they should not be violated unless we're in such extremity that to do so will bring about huge benefits or prevent much worse calamities. And that's what the essay is really about. It's about trying to set up some understanding of how a socialist revolution needs to be constrained by moral constraints and the recognition of individual rights.
So in Gerras's work, and also obviously in your own, you're recognizing that violence resistance, of course, has its own morally bad consequences, and that leads to how do we decide that nevertheless in some situations violent actions are, perhaps one could say, the less unethical choice. So what is the criteria for decision? What is almost the flow chart, as it were, that one might go down to say, in this instance, we have got to do this thing, which otherwise in normal society we wouldn't do?
Yeah, so these are incredibly difficult questions to answer, in part because you need to set up and define boundaries, which are very hard to do without there being some sense of them being arbitrary. But there are two ways of thinking about this, at least two ways. There are many more, but two ways that I want to deal with. The first is to think of violent resistance as being required when you face what people like Michael Walzer and various others call a supreme emergency. Now, a supreme emergency is when the threat to yourself or to your community is existential. The enemy you're fighting against is going to destroy you and your culture, and there's no alternative but to resort to violent action to try and prevent that. So an example that's very often used is that when the Nazis were in such ascendancy in Europe in the early 1940s, Britain and the Western world and the free world faced what would be considered at that point a supreme emergency. The evil that was Nazism, if it was to have triumphed, would have been such a moral catastrophe that this gave those fighting the Nazis some leeway into using methods which otherwise would have been considered to be immoral in terms of just war theory and in terms of morality generally. So there is the issue of the supreme emergency. And as I say, the supreme emergency is a threshold where the evil that you're fighting against, those who are coming to oppress you, or the tyranny that you're fighting against, is such a moral catastrophe that it requires you to use methods that ordinarily would be rejected as immoral or against just war theory or against any kind of reasonable moral boundaries. Stuart Hampshire uses a different set of criteria, but it's not very far away from supreme emergency, but it's more general. He talks about what he refers to as the great evils. Those kinds of, he calls natural and social great evils. And natural great evils will be earthquakes and volcanoes and all those droughts and those kind of things. But social evils will be the kind of evils other human beings inflict upon us. So again, if they are engaging in torture and murder and destruction of home and property and imprisonment without trials and all those kinds of things that we think of as great evils that make life impossible for anybody to live a reasonable or a decent or a tolerable life. If this is constantly going on with no end in sight and no possibility of dealing with this in a non-violent way, this would allow you to move once again across the threshold into using violent resistance of some kind. So those are two ways of thinking about the problem. But again, note that the background is that you use some kind of non-violent resistance unless those thresholds are breached. And again, as I said, it's difficult to know just how to set those thresholds. There are cases where it's obvious, like with the Nazis, but there are other cases where it's on the threshold and not quite, and there's some controversy about whether you should be using violence as a resistance to that tyranny or to that oppression. But again, it's the devil's in the detail. This would have to be looked at in each particular case, and those are at least some clear principled ways in which you can distinguish between non-violent resistance and violent resistance.
I think you also look at issues like whether you've got a chance of it actually producing the desired effect. I mean, whether you're just going to be. I mean, it's got to actually have a chance of succeeding,
Yeah.
and proportionality, those sort of issues as well.
Yeah, that's right. So once you've agreed, or once you've realized that you have to cross that boundary into violent resistance, that's not the end of the story, because you don't want to resist where it's going to be simply either suicidal or it's going to end up being the case that you make the situation even worse, if that's possible. So I set out 3 criteria which I think might guide when you think that this violent resistance is legitimate. One is there has to be a reasonable chance of success. So if you're just going to be killing and slaughtering or doing whatever you're doing, but there's no chance of you winning at all, then it looks like this is not going to be something that can be justified morally. Again, it all depends on what kind of a threat that you're facing. I mean, if you're facing something like a genocidal regime, the Nazis killing the Jews and the Gypsies and various others, then any kind of resistance really would be justified, because they're just going to slaughter you. But regimes like the Nazis are rare, fortunately. And most of the time when you're resisting, you're resisting those who have certain kinds of political demands, which are unreasonable or unfair, but they are demands, and if you meet them, they're not going to just slaughter you and kill you. So there's the reasonable success. The second is proportionality. The fact that you've now crossed a moral boundary doesn't give you license to use any kind of violence or any kind of destruction that you see fit. It means you can't go and slaughter innocent people just for the sake of slaughtering them so that you can make a point. It has to be as targeted as it possibly can be. Now, again, the devil's in the detail, because often those who are being oppressed don't have the means to target in the precise way that they're talking about. But generally speaking, that should be a guiding principle, that you should be try to be proportionate in the way you respond to what's happening. And thirdly, and this perhaps is the most vague of all, is that you need people who are going to be leading this kind of resistance to act from moral motives. Now, I can hear people immediately saying, well, how do we know they have moral motives? The answer is we don't. But for those who want to be moral in their resistance to tyranny and so on, they need to be be acting in a way that encompasses the kind of moral boundaries that we've been talking about here. And it's important that we have leaders who have those moral boundaries, because even if you don't have leaders like that, it's very, very simple, very, very easy for it to slide into some form of tyranny if they win the battle. And we've seen this in many, many revolutions. People use all sorts of methods and terrible methods to get what they get, to get what they want. They become in charge of the country, and then they continue using these methods against their very own people. It doesn't take long before revolutions that don't have the right kind of method of getting there ending up cannibalizing their own, ending up being as tyrannical or even worse than the regimes that they're trying to change.
So that last point is actually a practical point as well as a moral point, that we know from experience that once these things that we should be trying as much as possible to live the sort of society that we're trying to create. You spoke before about the just war theory, and part of that is that you only attack the combatants, you don't attack civilians. So would you say that that's part of it as well? Or, I mean, that's perhaps part of the proportionality that you were talking about.
For sure, definitely. I mean, within just war theory, there are the jus ad bellum and the jus in bello principles. Now, the ad bellum principles is essentially, when is it just to go to war? In our context, when is it just to use violence? The in bello principles are, what do you do while engaging in that war? What kind of methods would be just methods? So two of the main principles of the in bello concerns are proportionality, and the other one is not attacking non-combatants. In other words, civilians or people who are not involved in the actions. Now, those two things are in just war theory to try and prevent needless violence and needless killing and destruction. So the proportionality principle would say something along the lines of, you need to use as much force as is necessary to gain your objective, and no more than that. So in order to take a particular city or a hill or an area where you think is of military importance, you need to do just enough violence to bring about that objective, rather than to kill many, many people in the periphery, or to use excessive force to do so. And the non-combatant story, the non-combatant principle, is really that only those who are actually engaged in combat, or who are military or military part of the military structure, are really liable to be killed, is the technical term, are there liable to be attacked. Those who are people outside of that, women, children, civilians, elderly, all the rest, are not to be targets in the kind of violence that you use. There's a good example in the South African case with the ANC and their attacks on the South African apartheid government. When Nelson Mandela and that group of people were seeking to remove the tyranny of an apartheid regime, they tried non-violent means, and they were locked up, and they did all sorts of things like that. Eventually resorted to military means, and they started blowing up pylons and attacking police stations. Notice that that's a legitimate way of using violence to remove repression. If they'd attacked schools or hospitals or innocent civilians, this would have been going outside the boundaries of what would be legitimate violent resistance.
So, you've given an example of these ideas perhaps being used. Do we know if these? I mean, do we have examples of these actually being debated? I mean, are there records of organizations rather than academics debating these basic principles?
Well, you're taking me outside an area of my competence, but I suspect that within all organizations that are about to engage in violent resistance, there has to be some very serious soul searching to decide how they're going to do it, when they're going to do it, what the repercussions of that are going to be, the kind of messy, unintended consequences that's going to arise from that. So I don't know exactly what's been said amongst these organizations, but I'm pretty sure that if they've got any senses at all, they will have a very serious discussion about this. One of the things I would like to add is that although the theory sounds fairly clear, it's not all that clear, but although it sounds clear and that the boundaries are there and the principles are there, there's always a very, very grave difficulty in actually applying it to the real world, because the real world is very messy from a moral point of view. It's a place where moral values sometimes get dismissed or pushed aside, or the actual conditions on the ground make it very difficult for people to act that way. There are the psychological inputs and the way people impulsively do things. So there are all these kinds of problems that arise in the actual operationalization of the moral conditions. That said, and it's well acknowledged that in every war there are atrocities, and in every war there are problems. It's important that at least the leadership try to maintain this kind of normative boundaries around the kind of resistance that they're engaged in. Again, for practical purposes, as we pointed out a bit earlier, so they can prefigure the kind of society that they want to bring in, and also because they want to be better than the people they're trying to remove. From a moral point of view, they don't want to replace one tyranny with another. They want to come across as persons who respect human rights, who give people freedom, who give people the kinds of things they need to lead full and tolerable and fulfilled lives. And if you start off by just wanton killing and aggression and without any kind of moral boundaries, there's a very good chance it'll slide into that when you go back into the normal day-to-day running of a society later on.
And is something like the Geneva Convention helpful for this sort of situation in guiding people about what's permissible practice and what isn't?
Yes, it is. The Geneva Convention tries to formulate what would be acceptable in terms of the way we treat other people. So the way you treat prisoners, for example, or the way and the kind of weapons that you use. All those things are crucial and essential for making sure that the kind of violence that is used is contained. Because the problem with violence, the problem with violent resistance, is that it ends up killing people and injuring them and destroying property and all those kinds of things. These are terrible things to do. And not only that, it's done on a scale that is mind-boggling. I don't have to tell you, I mean, we right now looking at what's happening in the Ukraine. I mean, the kind of destructive power that we have with modern weaponry and the effect it has on innocent civilians and just on the society generally is awesome. Absolutely awesome. And that's not even talking about the kind of nuclear weapons and biological and chemical. Just the conventional weapons are awesome. So we need some kind of constraint in this. And the constraint has to come from the leaders knowing that there are boundaries in the way in which they should act. They're not allowed to use weapons that are mala in se, as the expression goes, that cause, that are evil in themselves. You can't do those kinds of things. You can't use weapons that cause unreasonable amounts of damage and pain and suffering. And the reason for this is to try and contain the violence, to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand, it doesn't cause more suffering and destruction than it actually is going to cause, even if it's necessary to engage in such actions.
And just obviously we're having this discussion because of the way the PKK is described as a terrorist organization, without particularly addressing the PKK, but how might these ideas help us when we're looking at the way organizations or individuals are branded as terrorists?
Okay, so let me give a little bit of a preamble to that. The issue about who are terrorists and who are not is a hugely fraught one, as you well know. Depending on which side of the fight you're on, so the other side is either a terrorist or a freedom fighter. Now, the view that says one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist and vice versa, I've never felt was a particularly useful way of understanding this issue. I think it is clear that if you look at the details, you look at what these groups are doing, you look at how they've behaved in the past and what they're doing what they intend to do in the future, it is clear to make a distinction between freedom fighters and terrorists. So when parts of the Western world were calling the ANC resistance against apartheid in South Africa, I'll use that example again, and calling them terrorists, they just got it wrong. They were trying very hard to remove oppression and tyranny, and they were freedom fighters to that extent. On the other hand, if you look at ISIS and the way in which they behaved in Iraq and Syria, where they've taken slaves and they've raped hundreds and hundreds of women, where they've slaughtered people who have different views from themselves, they're not freedom fighters. No matter how sympathetic you are to this particular view they might have from an ideological point of view, their behavior makes them terrorists. So I've never been one that says you can't distinguish between the two. Again, the stuff that we've been talking about, all the information we're talking about, is one of the ways in which you can decide whether the group that you're dealing with is is a terrorist group or a free fighting group. If they are sticking to moral boundaries, if they are resisting certain kinds of oppression, certain kinds of tyranny, if they are trying to bring about change through peaceful means and failing over and over and over again because of the intransigence of the regime or the group they're fighting, and yet when they start using violent resistance, they keep within those boundaries, then I think you can refer to them as freedom fighters rather than as terrorists. So my view on this is the devil's in the detail. You look to see what's being done, you look to see if the criteria are being met, and on that basis you decide whether people or groups are terrorists or not.
Thank you. I think you've given us a lot of things to think about. I'm going to ask you if you want a final word, but I'm very struck that particularly at the beginning, actually, you mentioned not only a right to resistance, but that some people have argued that in some instances there's a duty of resistance. And I wonder if in summing up, you'd like to add anything more about that.
Right. So I think I'd like to draw a distinction between those who are the political representatives and those who are individuals. As an individual, I think you have a right to resist, but you don't have a duty to do so. You might be a pacifist, for example, and decide that I think violence is wrong under all circumstances, and therefore I'm not going to resist. I'm prepared even to be dead rather than to use violence. I think that's a right you have as an individual. However, as a political activist or somebody who has the lives and the well-being of others under your control or in your care, I think you simply don't have that option. One of the major duties of a political representative or one of your leaders is to try and keep you safe from the violence and the predations of others. And so I think not only do you have a right to resist as a leader of a group, but you have a duty to do so for those under your care. And it's under that basis, I think, that that distinction I want to make between the right and the duties. So political leaders, they have a right and a duty. Individuals, they have a right but not a duty.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving us a lot of things to think about. Dr. Steve de Wijze, thanks very much for being on Media News today.
Thank you for having me.